Coherence of Theism seeks to explain what theism, the claim common to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that there is a God, or rather more precisely, that there is a divine person, it seeks to explain what it means, and whether that claim is a coherent claim, that is, whether it is conceivable or free from internal contradiction to suppose that it is true. Clearly, it means something like there is a person who is essentially non-embodied, that is a spirit, present everywhere, that is omnipresent, the creator of of any universe there is, perfectly free, able to do anything, that is omnipotent, knowing all things, that is omniscient, perfectly good, a source of moral obligation, eternal, a necessary being, holy and worthy of worship. Almost all the words which I have just used are words with ordinary meanings, or words which can be defined very easily by such words. And I devoted several chapters of part 2 of the Coherence of Theism to showing how this can be done for almost all the words. For example, we can experience intentional power in ourselves when we perform intentional actions, such as causing our bodies to move. An omnipotent being is just one who can achieve anything by these means. We recognize knowledge in ourselves when we know that 2 and 2 equals 4. We recognize goodness when we reflect on the goodness of certain actions, actional or imaginary. Omnipotence is just the power to which there are no limits. Omniscience is just knowledge of all true propositions. A perfectly good agent is one who always does the best, where there is a best, and otherwise always does some good action, but never a bad action. In the Coherence of Theism, I gave reasons for understanding eternal as everlasting, that is, as existing at all periods of time, past, present, or future, and omniscient as knowing all true propositions which it's logically possible to know, and that excludes propositions about God's or humans' free actions. And if we ignore for the moment, the adverb essentially in front of all these divine properties, which governs all of them, and we also ignore the predicate of being a necessary being, we can conceive what it would be like to be such a being of the kind which I have described. That is to say, an omnipotent, omniscient, and so on being. If you forget the suggestion, it's an essentially omnipotent being. We can conceive what it would be like for it to be such a being, in the sense that we know what the words in the definitions of the technical terms mean, and we know how those words can be ultimately explained in terms of what we experience or observe. And we can see that the claim that there is such a being does not entail any contradiction. I argued in the Coherence of Theism that a person having all the listed properties, apart from the property of being a necessary being, all the listed properties non-essentially, follows from that person being omnipotent in a wide sense. I shall call such a being a deity. Arguments to the existence of such a being from the nature of the natural world, of a kind which I discussed in The Existence of God, the second volume of the trilogy, of which the Coherence of Theism is the first volume, are arguments to the simplest kind of being whose actions would explain the existence and nature of the universe, and, as the simplest explanation thereof, make it probable that there exists such a God. But if that deity is to be truly the source of everything, apart from himself, and so to provide an ultimate explanation, not merely of what does happen, but of what could have happened or could be happening or could happen in future, he needs to be essentially, everlastingly omnipotent. If such a being were not essentially omnipotent, then it would be an additional brute fact that God existed in the distant past. It would be a mere fortunate accident that the omnipotent being had not come into existence only recently. Nor would there be any guarantee that he would not abdicate that is, abandon some of his powers. And if he did abdicate, then perhaps some more ultimate principle could determine what happens. And so that more ultimate principle would, as it were, be standing ready to determine the future if God did not choose to do so. Only an essentially omnipotent being can rule these possibilities out and so provide the ultimate explanation of things. But, I claimed, in order to make sense of the claim that God is not just an everlasting, omnipotent person, but an essentially everlasting, omnipotent person, we need to understand some of the words in the definition in analogical senses. That is, we need analogy to talk about God is not new. It is essential to Aquinas' account of theism that in his view all predicates ascribed to God are used in analogical senses. But for Aquinas, to ascribe to God a predicate designating a property used in an analogical sense is simply to ascribe the same property as we ascribe in ordinary talk to other beings, such as humans, but to claim that it belongs to God in a superior way. On Aquinas' view, the res significata of, for example, wise, is the same as the wisdom which we ascribe to Socrates, but the way in which God is wise, in knowing more and in being directly aware of the things of which he is wise, is superior to the way in which Socrates is wise. God, according to Aquinas, is wise eminentiori modo. But as Duns Scotus pointed out, this really amounts to saying that the predicates used of humans and of God are used univocally. I argued in the Coherence of Theism that if we are to avoid contradictions which arise if we suppose that God has the divine properties essentially, we must suppose that the property designated by one of these words, the res significata, is not the same as the property designated by those words when applied to humans. And the word for which we must understand that is the word person. If God is a person, even if he has this property in some way more fully than we do, and if he exists everlastingly, then what makes him the same person at different instants of time would be satisfying the criteria, whatever they are, which makes any other person the same person. I argued in the Coherence of Theism, and I have argued more fully elsewhere, that being the same person as a later person is an ultimate relation. Person P1 at P2 at time T1 is the same person as person P2 at T2. This is not a matter of continuity of body or brain or memory or character or any other properties. While such continuities between persons, P1 and P2, are evidence that P2 is the same as P1, they do not constitute being the same person. It is always an irreducible fact that two persons at different times are or are not the same person. Now, that's my view, and not everyone agrees with it, but not everyone agrees with my account of personal identity. But almost every philosopher would agree that for P2 to be the same person as P1, P1 does not have to have exactly the same body, brain, memory, and character. And in the case of non-embodied persons, P2 can be the same as P1, even if P2 has a bit more or a bit less of any property, such as power or knowledge. So if our deity is a person in the ordinary sense, he could remain the same person while gaining or losing power or knowledge, and while existing up to a certain time, he could then commit suicide, and that is incompatible with him being essentially everlastingly omnipotent. A further difficulty, in my view, for supposing God to be a person in the ordinary sense is that persons have what is often called thisness. A substance S has thisness if there could have been, instead of S, a substance which has exactly the same properties as S, but is not S. Properties include both intrinsic properties and relations to other substances, including relations of continuity with past substances. So, I have thisness because instead of me, there could have been someone lecturing to you today who had this body, was having the same conscious thoughts as I do, and was spatially continuous with the same past bodies, and whose memory and whose conscious thoughts were continuous with the same past memory and conscious thoughts as I have, and yet this person was not me. Again, that's my view, but again, not all philosophers agree with me about this, but many non-philosophers would, I think, agree. In any case, if I'm right, this makes a further difficulty for the claim that God is a person in the ordinary sense. For given the thisness of persons, theism then has to postulate that just one deity out of the innumerable possible deities is God, and so theism becomes the hypothesis not just that there exists an essentially everlastingly omnipotent being, but the hypothesis that there exists a certain particular such being. And this leaves it totally inexplicable why this God is the one in charge of the universe, rather than any other one who has exactly the same properties. And this would make theism a much more complicated hypothesis than it would otherwise be, and for that reason, less likely to be true. The solution provided by those few past thinkers who considered this issue was that God does not have thisness. Any being with the same properties as the actual God would be the same being as the actual God. Augustine claimed that, quote, God is improperly called substance, but he is truly and properly called essence, which seems to entail that there is nothing more to him than his properties, and so that he does not have thisness. And Aquinas more explicitly wrote that, quote, it is in virtue of the one and the same fact that he is God and that he is this God. I should add that it's not a wild suggestion to suppose that some substance does not have thisness, since the majority view of physicists is that fundamental particles, such as electrons, do not have thisness. But if persons do have thisness, or ordinary persons have thisness, and God doesn't, because it would make it a much more complicated hypothesis, we need to explain that person is being used in a different sense. The view of God, who is what he is, in virtue of being in control at all times of everything that happens, and not in virtue of a thisness which makes him a particular person, suggests a different model for God, not as a person, but as a supreme form. Plato held that the forms or ideas, the essences of things situated outside the world of change, determine how particular changing substances behaved, and he suggested that there was a supreme form, the form of the good, which determines everything. A form, in Plato's sense, is a property. The form of an individual table is just the property of being a table, and the form of the good is just goodness itself. Hence, forms do not have any underlying thisness. There couldn't be two forms of being a table different from each other. Influenced by Plato, some of the early Christian theologians thought of God as this form of the good, or goodness itself, and this, understood without qualification, would mean thinking of God as nothing but a changeless, impersonal principle. The modern equivalent of such a timeless principle is a law of nature, on a particular account of laws of nature, which is called the relations between universals account of law of nature, RBU, has been articulated in slightly different ways by Armstrong, Tooley, and Dretsky. This view of laws of nature claims that laws are logically contingent relations of nomic necessity or probability between universals, that is, between properties. On this account, for example, Newton's law of gravity, the law that, quote, all substances attract all other substances with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart, is to be analyzed as there being a relation of nomic necessity joining the universals or properties of mass, distance, and force of such a kind that when universals of mass m and of mass m dash are instantiated in two substances at a distance r from each other, there is a force of attraction between them proportional to mm dash over r squared. On Thules's version of this account, which I believe to be the more satisfactory one, properties and the relations between them, that is, universals and the relations between them, exist whether or not there are any substances whose behavior is governed by them. Like the more widely accepted regularity account of laws of nature, the RBU account holds that whether one event causes another one is a consequence of laws of nature. So, on this RBU account, laws of nature are changeless relations between entities, between universals, independent of the substances governed by them. Laws of nature, the forms, do not have thisness. There couldn't be a different law of gravity other than the actual one, but which had the same effect on all physical objects. And if it was really a fundamental law of nature, and not merely a regularity which holds under certain conditions, or one which holds because God allows it to hold, if it was really a fundamental law of nature, and was a reality independent of the physical objects which are constrained to act in accordance with it, then it must hold forever. Any law of this kind which began to hold or ceased to hold or changed its mode of operation would never have been a fundamental principle governing nature ever. On the view of God as a supreme form, he plays the role which atheist scientists attribute to fundamental laws of physics on the RB account. If we think of God as a supreme form or as a law of nature on the RBU account, he would not be merely essentially forwardly, but essentially backwardly everlasting. So, if we think of these laws as independent of the substances governed by them, and by their very nature governing throughout all time, then that becomes a model for God. But just as we have seen, God cannot be a person in the ordinary sense, because he does not have thisness, and he is what he is in virtue of his essential everlastingness and omnipotence, so God cannot be a form or essence in the ordinary sense. In the ordinary sense of a form, despite Plato's own contrary view, and of a law of nature on the RBU account, it is individual substances or events which cause effects. The forms of substances or laws of nature on the normal account merely determine which events substances or events cause. The form of a table does not cause a table to exist. It merely determines what a table made by a carpenter will be like. And the law of gravity does not cause material objects to exist. It merely determines what effects already existing substances will have on other substances. And forms do not choose how they will act. They have no free choice. So God cannot be a person or a form in the ordinary senses of either of these words. These words must be being used analogically, in a certain sense of analogically, which I will now explain. The sense of a word is determined by the difference its use makes to the meaning of sentences which include it, and so to the propositions which those sentences express. The meaning of a sentence is determined by what I call the syntactic and semantic rules for its use. The syntactic rules relate a given sentence to other sentences. They state to which other sentences you are explicitly committing by affirming the given sentence, and which other sentences explicitly commit you to the given sentence. Thus, the meaning of the word knows, K-N-O-W-S, the meaning of knows is determined partly by syntactic rules such as if S knows that P entails P, whereas if S believes that P, that does not entail P. S knows that P entails S believes that P, whereas S thinks about P does not entail S believes that P, and so on. Its meaning is given by its relation to other propositions. The semantic rules point to or describe paradigm examples of situations in which sentences containing the word are true and contrast them with ones in which the sentences containing the word are false. They point to clear cases where sentences of the form S knows that P are true. For example, in the present situation, I know that I am now lecturing, uttered by me, is true, and I know that it rained in New York on the 1st of November, 1600 AD, is false. I know this is false. Paradigm example of some item of knowledge that I don't have. To use a word analogically, in my sense, is to alter these rules, both the syntactic and semantic ones, somewhat. One can do this for the syntactic rules by adding new rules and/or by abandoning some of the existing rules, and for the semantic rules by changing the roles of the paradigm examples. For example, the rule may say that to be a case of phi, an object has to resemble some paradigm phi things as much as they resemble each other. Or, alternatively, it may say that to be phi, an object has to resemble phi things more than do some paradigm non-phi things. I shall claim that theism abandons some of the syntactic rules for person and form and changes the role of the paradigm examples for each word. Changing the rules for using a word designating a property has the consequence that it now designates a different property. The res significata is different. But first, let us consider a non-theological example of this process. Since the 16th century, there have been two views about the nature of light. There is the view that light radiating from a source consists of a stream of particles, or the alternative view that it consists of a wave in a medium. Until the beginning of the 20th century, it was thought that one or other view was the correct view, and they held alternate dominance. Wave theory holds that light is the propagation of a disturbance, originally the form of a disturbance in a material medium, but later a disturbance in an electromagnetic field. But on both versions, what was propagated is a disturbance, a change in the state of things at the places along the path of the wave, without any material object moving along that path. Whereas on the particle theory, the propagation of light along a path consists in the motion of particles, material objects, along that path. Since 1905, however, neither theory can be regarded as an exclusive possession of the field. Many phenomena are known which are fully explained by the theory that light is a wave and seem quite inconsistent with the particle theory. Among these phenomena are diffraction and interference. Yet many other phenomena are known which are fully explained by the theory that light consists of particles and seem quite inconsistent with the wave theory. Among these are the photoelectric effect and the Compton effect, and above all the fact that when very weak light irradiates a photographic plate, a lot of tiny blobs appear on the plate, not a very weak smear over the whole plate, as the wave theory would suggest. So neither theory seems fully adequate to the phenomena. There have been many attempts to construct more adequate theories, but but no theory which gives an easily comprehensible account of the nature of light has yet had any success in explaining old or new phenomena. What we do have is quantum theory, a highly sophisticated piece of mathematics which allows us, when we have learnt the rules for applying it, to predict within a range how light will behave, as well as a vast number of other physical and chemical phenomena. But science is not merely a predicting device. It seeks to tell us what the substances are which are causing the phenomena. And what, in effect, though lacking the philosophical apparatus to make this explicit, most scientists will say is that light consists of photons, which are, quote, particles and, quote, waves, in analogical senses of those words. In giving an analogical sense to wave, the word wave, they loosen the semantic rule so that it's the semantic rule which states that an object's a wave if and only if it's like water waves, sound waves, waves in oil and lemonade, and electromagnetic waves. They alter the rule that something is only a wave if it's like those waves in the respect in which they are like each other, more than paradigm examples of objects which are not waves, such as billiard balls, grains of sand, and cherry stones. And in giving an analogical sense to particle, they loosen the semantic rule so that it states that an object is a particle if it is like billiard balls, grains of sand, and cherry stones in the respect in which they are like each other, more than the paradigm examples of objects which are not particles, for example, waves and sound waves. They also drop the explicit syntactic rules that anything is a wave. If it's a wave, it's not also a material object, and if anything is a particle, it's not also a disturbance in a medium. Just explain that again. Original rules, something is a particle, if and only if it's like billiard balls, cherry stones, and so on, in the respect in which they are like each other. Stretch the rule so that something is a particle if and only if it's like billiard balls and cherry stones more than it's like waves in a medium. Conversely, an old rule, something is a wave in a medium if and only if it's like sound waves, waves in water, waves in lemonade, as much as they are like each other. New rule, it's like waves in it's like sound waves, waves in water and lemonade, in the respect that more than they are like non-waves. In other words, more than they are like billiard balls and so on. It stretches what counts as a particle and counts as a wave. And this is just the same thing, I wish to argue. This stretching of our understanding of the paradigm examples of wave and particle is just the same thing as happens when theism claims that God is both a person and a form. We retain the same paradigm examples of persons, but insist that in order to be a person, some being needs only to resemble the paradigm examples of persons more than do objects which are paradigm examples of non-persons. But it does not insist that in order to be called a person, something has to resemble the paradigm examples of persons as much as they resemble each other. The paradigm examples of non-persons are those ordinary substances which you unhesitatingly and naturally say are not persons, for example, houses or trees or tables. So we change the paradigm examples in both cases so as to allow a wider sense of person and form. With two exceptions, we retain all the syntactic rules linking person with other expressions. As before, a person is, of logical necessity, a mental substance who is capable of having mental events of some sophistication. So, a person who knows P believes P, and a person who has the thought that P is conscious that he has the thought of P, and so on. Those rules are retained. But there are exceptions. The first exception is as follows. We abandon any syntactic rules which allow us to deduce from S is a person propositions of the form S could have had less power or knowledge than he has. And the second exception is that we abandon any syntactic rules which allow us to infer from S is a person any propositions of the form there could have been a different person instead of S who has all the same properties as S. Then, in the new wide analogical sense of person, it will be a contingent truth about certain kinds of person, human persons, that they could exist with less power or knowledge than they have at some time, and also that they have thisness. In this analogical sense, the theist would normally claim God is a person. So we understand God is a person by having a wider sense of person, dropping the criteria to be a person. Someone has to be rather like us, and insisting all that's necessary is that he's more like us than trees and tables are. And we drop the rule that if he's a person, he could have had less power and knowledge that he has, and the rule that if he's a person, then there could have been another person with the same properties. We drop those rules, so we have an extended sense of person in both by amending the syntactic and semantic rules. Similarly, with form, we retain the same paradigm examples of forms, that is, properties, or laws of nature on the RBU account, but insist that in order to be a form, some being only needs to resemble the paradigm examples of form more than do objects which are paradigm examples of non-forms, but does not need to resemble the paradigm examples of forms as much as they resemble each other. The paradigm examples of non-forms are those ordinary things which we unhesitatingly and naturally say are substances, not properties. For example, houses or trees or tables or human beings. It also involves abandoning any syntactic rules which allow us to infer from S is a form that S exists or causes effects only if it is instantiated in some substance, or that X is immutable, that is, does not change in any respect at all. We abandon the rule, any syntactic rules which allow us to infer from S is a form that S does not change in any respect at all. But we retain such rules as that S is a form entails S does not have thisness, and from S is a fundamental form entails if S exists at one time, S exists at all times. So this process of changing the syntactic rules, changing the semantic rules, leaves us with concepts such that we know the sense, some of their entailments, and with paradigm examples, which might only be examples of only a small subclass of entities which would properly be called waves or particles, persons or forms, in the new analogical senses. If we widen the scope, all we know about what it is to be a form and what it is to be a person are the paradigm examples we've got, and we know that there are many others, and we don't know what sort of others they might be. So while allowing us to judge that certain unobservable entities are in some sense waves, they give us little hold on what it is to be a wave in the new analogical sense. We cannot conceive what such waves really are like in themselves, merely in virtue of being waves in the analogical sense. We know only the consequences of something being a wave in the analogical sense, and that only in certain circumstances, that is, when it is also a particle. So, by changing the rules, we don't know very much about what it is to be a wave or what it is to be a particle. And the question inevitably arises, why suppose that it's logically possible that there can be something which is both a wave and a particle in this sense? And the answer obviously is because we have a vast range of data which make it very probable that quantum theory would be true if it were logically possible. If it's not logically possible for a particle in the extended sense to be a wave in the extended sense, then quantum theory cannot be true. But if it is possible, then it is true. And if it's very probable indeed that quantum theory would be true if it were logically possible, that in turn makes it probable, a bit less probable than very probable, but probable all the same, that it is true, and so logically possible, and so that these are compatible properties. The evidence for quantum theory is the evidence that if it is logically possible, then it is probably true. And there's so much evidence for that there is evidence that it is logically possible. Because if it were not logically possible, then we would not have an explanation of all the enormous phenomena that we do have. Similarly, if arguments from the most general features of the universe to something which explains these make it very probable that, if it is logically possible, something is both a person and a form in analogical senses, that makes it at least somewhat more probable than not that some such thing exists, and so that these are compatible properties. I argued in The Existence of God that arguments from the most general features of the universe do make it probable that, if it is logically possible for something to be both a person and a form in analogical senses, make it probable that there is a God who has both of these otherwise incompatible properties, and so makes it somewhat more probable than not that these are compatible properties. In this short paper, I have discussed only how understanding words in analogical senses enables us to understand what it is for there to be a person who is essentially a divine person. In this book, I discuss also the role of analogy in helping us to understand what it is for a divine person to be a necessary being. So, that is my thesis. We do change in order to understand the claim that there is a God, we have to understand the claim that he is in some sense a person in an analogical way by changing the rules, changing the semantic rules, changing the syntactic rules. But we have another model for God. In a certain sense, he's a form because he determines everything and he's unchanging. But we have to amend our rules for form in order to understand that. That gives us wider senses of these concepts. But then we've changed the rules for these concepts so that it's rather doubtful, or needs to be argued, that in fact it's logically possible there can be such a being. The reason to believe it's logically possible that there can be such a being is that we have a theory, theism, which makes sense of the whole world if it is logically possible that it's true. So, it is probably logically possible that it is true, otherwise we couldn't make sense of the world. And that is the argument. Thank you.